We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Dalet Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 34a. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought a machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. What if somebody who is tamei touches kodesh? According to Reish Lakish, there is malchus in that situation, and the reason is because there's a lav. The pasuk says b'chol kodesh lo siga. She can't touch kodesh, talking about when the person is tamei, and so therefore that is a lo saseh, a negative commandment, and there is malchus. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. He says that the pasuk of b'chol kodesh lo siga is actually talking about truma. It is not talking about kodesh. The Gemara then goes on to say that Reish Lakish uses B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga for something else as well. He uses it as a warning for a situation of a person who's Tameh, who eats Kodesh. In that situation, there is a punishment we know of Kares, and this pasuk of B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga is giving the warning, the Azhara, for that situation. Again, a scenario where a person who is Tameh eats Kodesh. Rabbi Yochanan learns that from somewhere else. He learns that warning from a Gzera Shava of Tumaso. The Gemara now is in the middle of bringing a brisa that supports Reish Lakish. The pasuk which says B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga goes on to say Ve'al HaMikdash Lo Savo, and we compare the two to one another in order to learn out the context of what that pasuk is talking about. Just like Ve'al HaMikdash Lo Savo is something that involves Netilas Neshama, it involves the taking of life. Rashi explains Netilas Neshama is Kares. That refers to Kares. Again, that was mentioned on the previous Amud. The idea is that when the person enters the Mikdash Tameh, so there's a punishment of Kares, and the two parts of the pasuk are compared to one another. Af Kodesh, so too when it comes to Kodesh. What are we talking about when it says B'chol Kodesh Lo Siga? It's not simply talking about touching. It's Davar Sheyesh Bo Netilas Neshama. It's something that involves the taking of the soul, meaning Kares. V'iben Nogeya. Now, if we're just talking about Nogeya, if we're only talking about touching, Netilas Neshama Mi'ika, is there Netilas Neshama in that situation? There is not. And so therefore we can understand the pasuk also is talking about a warning for the person who's Tameh to eat Kodesh. And so therefore, again, Ela B'achila, rather the pasuk is referring to Achila. Again, this is all a brisa, and this brisa supports Reish Lakish. But the Gemara continues and asks, Va'akati, but still, mi boi lei l'tamei sha'achal b'sar kodesh lifnei zrika. Don't we need this pasuk for a case of someone who is tamei, who eats the b'sar kodesh, who eats the meat from a carbon before the zrika, before the applying, the throwing of the blood? Rashi explains, V'akati mi boile, don't we still need this pasuk? V'kevan de la'achar zrika nafkalon minei. Now, if we're talking here about eating after zrika, and we'll see as the Gemara goes on the distinction between the meat of the carbon before zrika and the meat of the carbon after zrika. So the point over here, the question is, if we need the pasuk for lifnei zrika, how could we also use it for la'achar zrika? Hey l'chiyolef minei tarti. How do we learn both ideas from this pasuk? That's the question of the Gemara. Again, v'akati mi boile l'tamei shachal b'sar kodesh lifnei zrika. Isn't this pasuk needed for a situation of somebody who's tamei, who eats b'sar kodesh lifnei zrika? And on that we have a machlokas, the itmar, because it was stated on that in that particular scenario, the following machlokas amoraim. Again, a machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. The case is tamei shachal b'sar kodesh lifnei zrika. If a tamei person eats meat of kodesh before zrika, Reish Lakish amar loka. Reish Lakish says it's malchus in that situation. That is not a situation of kares. Rabbi Yochanan amar eno loka. And Rabbi Yochanan says there's no malchus in that situation. So just like we have a machlokas with regards to malchus by a tamei person that touches kodesh, here you have a machlokas, a tamei person that eats b'sar kodesh before zrika. Again, a machlokas Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish says malchus. Rabbi Yochanan says no malchus. Reish Lakish amar loke. Reish Lakish says, how do we know there's malchus? Because the pasuk b'chol kodesh lo siga says you can't touch kodesh. Lo shna lifnei zrika, v'lo shna liachar zrika. It doesn't matter if it's before zrika. It doesn't matter if it's after zrika. Rabbi Yochanan amar eno loke. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, there's no malchus in that case. Lifnei zrika kidetani bardalat, because it's like Bardala taught. Again, Bardala was brought in the previous summit. That's the Gzera Shava Tumaso. Asya Tumaso. We make a Gzera Shava Tumaso. V'chi kasavahu la'achar zrika. And that pasuk over there, Tumaso, was written la'achar zrika, so we know we're talking la'achar zrika. And Rashi explains, again, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Asya Tumaso, we learn it from the Gzera Shava of Tumaso. That's Azharas Tamei Shelo Yochal Kodesh, the warning for a Tamei person not to eat Kodesh. That's learned from the Gzera Shava of Tumaso. Again, that was on the previous Amud. Alma, we see Azharaso Me Onsho Yalfa, that essentially the warning is being learned from the punishment. The Onsho La'achar Zrika, and we know the punishment is after Zrika. V'lo Lifnei Zrika, it's not before Zrika, and so therefore you understand that the warning is only talking in this pasuk about after Zrika. K'nektani b'Gemara dehakometz Rabbah. This is learned in the Gemara in Meseches Menachos and Hakometz Rabbah. Yachol yu chayavin olav mishum tuma lifnei zrikas damim. One might think that there is a liability for tuma before the zrikas damim. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, Kol tahor yochal basar v'hanefesh asher tochal basar. It says a pure person, a person who's tar, should eat the meat. And hanitar l'tahorim, we learn from that part of the pasuk that kind of meat which a tahor person is permitted to eat, that's the kind of meat chayav and olav misham tumah, that there's a liability when it comes to tumah, and so therefore that's talking specifically after zrika, that the meat of kodesh is eaten by pure people, and so that's where there's the liability in terms of a tamei person she'ein nitar l'tahorim. But if it was not permitted for tahorim, ein chayavim olav misham tumah, there is no liability because of tumah. And again, that's why Rabbi Yochanan says, he even says, Eino Loka, a tamei person who eats the B'sar Kodesh before Zrika, there is no malchus whatsoever. And in any case, the question of the Gemara again is, how can Reish Lakish use the same pasuk to teach us a tamei person eating the B'sar Kodesh after Zrika and before Zrika? And to that the Gemara says, Im kain, if so, Lema Kra Bakodesh. The pasuk could have just said Bakodesh if it was just teaching us one thing. Mai B'chol Kodesh. Why does it say B'chol Kodesh? What is that coming to teach us? Shema Min Tarti. From there we see both. Again, you see before Zrika and after Zrika. Rashi explains, Im kain de la'ochel la'achar zrika asar karaf. The pasuk is just talking about eating after zrika. Lichto bakodesh, say it should write bakodesh. Va'ano amina. And then I would say la'achar zrika, that we're talking after zrika, dumya de'onesh, similar to the punishment. And again, the fact that it says b'chol kodesh, that shows it's talking about both. And the Gemara continues, Gufa, returning to what we said above, Tamei sha'achal b'sar kodesh lifnei zrika. A tamei person eats meat of kodesh before the zrika. Again, there's a machlokas amoraim. Reish Lakish amar loka. Reish Lakish says there's malchus in that case. Rabbi Yochanan amar eino loka. Rabbi Yochanan says there is no malchus. Amar Abaya says machlokas b'tomas haguf. This machlokas, again about tamei sha'achal b'sar kodesh lifnei zrika, that's talking about when the person is tamei and he eats the b'sar kodesh before zrika. Aval b'tomas but let's say the meat itself would be tamei, so the person is eating the tamei meat before zrika. Divrei hakol loka. There, everybody agrees that there is malchus. Diyamar mar, because the master said. The Bach changes it from kra to mar. Diyamar mar, because the master said vehabasar. The pasuk says vehabasar, and that is the pasuk where we're learning this idea of tumas basar from. L'rabos eitzim ulavon. It even comes to include the wood and the frankincense. Even that is part of the prohibition. Delav b'nei achila ninu. Those are not even things which are normally eaten. V'afilu hachi ravinhu kra. Nevertheless, the pasuk includes them. And Rashi explains, machlokas b'tomas haguf. The machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, again by lifnei zrika, is by tomas haguf. B'ahu ka'amar Rabbi Yochanan eino loka. There Rabbi Yochanan says there is no malchus. The nafkale ashara me'onash. Again, he learns the warning from the punishment, so therefore the warning is talking specifically after zrika and not before zrika. Avol tomas basar, but when it comes to the meat being tamei, meaning tar sha'achal as tamei, a tar person eats the tamei meat. The azhara didei behed yoksivi. That warning is written explicitly. It says v'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yeachel divrei hakol loka. So there the pasuk already says lo yeachel, you cannot eat the meat that became tamei. Therefore everybody agrees that there is malchus. Diyamar mar, because the master said v'habasar yisera. That's an extra word v'habasar. T'chsib b'seife v'habasar kol tar, because it says at the end of the pasuk v'habasar kol tar. So there's an extra word v'habasar. We'll take a look at the full pasuk. The full pasuk v'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yeachel bo'eshi saref v'habasar kol tar yochal basar. So you see again, there's an extra word there. L'rabos eitzim ulavona. That extra word includes wood and the frankincense. L'tomas atzman. What that means is in terms of them becoming tamei. T'chibas hakodesh mechashartam, because the fact that there's chibas hakodesh, something is kodesh, is considered beloved, so to speak. So that prepares them to be able to receive tumah. That's the point. L'shavinu ochla. They're considered to be like food, that they are, so to speak, prepared to receive tumah, and they can become tamei. V'yavagav dahani lav b'nei achila ninu. Now, even though they're not edible, they're not things that are eaten. Ubasar lifnei zrika lo garaminayu. And the point is, meat before zrika is no worse than eitzim and lavona, and so therefore we understand that meat before zrika again is included in this prohibition. And the Gemara continues with another opinion. V'Rava Amar, and Rava says, Machlokas b'Tumas Haguf. The Machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, again before Zrika, is by Tumas Haguf when the person is Tameh. Aval b'Tumas Basar, but if the meat is Tameh, Divrei HaKol Eino Lokas. So everyone agrees that there is no Malkus. My time, and what's the reason? Kevan de lo Karina Bey, V'Tumaso Olav V'Nichrasa, since in a situation of Lifnei Zrika, we don't say that V'Tumaso Olav, that if the person is Tameh, that there is Kares. Again, that's only after Zrika that there is kares. So therefore, lo karina be, we also do not refer to the pasuk of v'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yachel. We don't apply the pasuk of v'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yachel. We don't apply that again at lifnei zrika. And Rashi explains, V'Rav Amar, and Rava says, B'Tumas Haguf, the Machlokas is by Tumas Haguf, Aval Tumas Basar, but when it comes to the meat being Tamei Iskish La'onesh, then it's compared to the punishment, and again, therefore, the Pasuk is only talking Lachar Zrika. To Samachle, the punishment is nearby. It says, V'Hanefesh Asher Tochal Basar, if the person eats the meat, to Kimna B'Lachar Zrika. And again, we say that that Pasuk is talking after Zrika. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'Amar Mar, but didn't the master say, and this we just quoted above, V'Habasar, again the extra word in the pasuk V'Habasar, L'Rabos Eitzim U'Levona, that includes the Eitzim and Levona, that includes the wood and the frankincense in this pasuk. Again, this pasuk of V'Habasar Asher Yiga B'Chol Tamei Lo Yeyachel, that includes Eitzim and Levona, and the assumption over here is that Eitzim and Levona essentially are the same as the meat before the Zrika, because you don't have something that's making them permitted. Again, the Zrikas Hadam, the throwing of the blood, the application of the blood is the matir, is the permitter, so to speak, for the carbon. You don't have that by Eitzim and Levona, and so therefore, if the pasuk is talking also about Eitzim and Levona, doesn't that imply that the pasuk is talking Lifnei Zrika? And the Gemara says not necessarily. Hacha b'mayaskin, and here what are we talking about? Kagon shekidshu b'kli. We're talking about where the Eitzim and the Levona were sanctified in a vessel. Denasa kamisha karvu kal matir. If that's the same as if bringing the matir, bringing the permitter. The kidsho b'chli, the sanctification in the vessel, is the same as the matir when it comes, again, let's say, to the zrikas hadam, when it comes to the meat of the carbon. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, this is a Mishnah in Me'ilah, kol sheyesh lo matirim, anything that has a matir, mishakarva matirav. So when the matir is brought, when the permitter is brought, so that's the point in time that we say again that there's a chiv, there's a liability. Kol she'ein lo matirim, but if there is no matir, like the Eitzim and the Levona, mishakidish b'kli, then we go by the time that they are sanctified in the vessel. And Rashi explains, shekidsho b'chli, that they are sanctified in a vessel. Eitzim shechata osan b'machtas klisharis me'alam mizbeach im gecholim. When it comes to the wood, the klisharis we're talking about is the shovel, which is a klisharis, and it would be taken off the mizbeach together with the coals using that shovel. That's the sanctification of the wood. U'levona, when it comes to the levona, the frankincense, shekidsha b'vazichin, that was sanctified in the bazichin, which were the bowls that were used for the levona. Diafilu kares b'tomas haguf nami isbu. Now in those situations, when they were kidsho b'chli, so then b'tomas haguf, there actually would be kares, and so therefore again, you see that the pasuk is talking about after the matir, so to speak. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, and again, when we explained it in the Gemara, we referred to a Mishnah in Me'ilah, which is similar to what the Gemara is quoting. The Shinui Nuschos has Ditanya, that we learned in a Brisa, Lekamon bePerek Beishamai, this is later in Perek Beishamai, if it's a Brisa, it's later on, Gabe Tomas Haguf, by Tomas Haguf, and again, Kol Sheyesh Lo Matir, and anything that has a permitter. What is a permitter? HaMatir no so ba'achila, meaning it's a process in the bringing of the carbon, which now allows the carbon to be eaten. So then chayavin olav misham tuma. Then there's a liability when the person is tamei mishakarva matirav, when the matir is brought. V'she'ein lo matir, and if there's no matirin mishakidesh b'kli, then we go by the sanctification in the vessel. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, it was stated the following machlokas amoraim, hamala evori behemu tameya al gabe hamizbeach. If somebody offers the limbs of a non-kosher animal on the mizbeach, so there's a machlokas amoraim as follows. Reish Lakish Amar Loka. Reish Lakish says the person gets malchus. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Eino Loka. Rabbi Yochanan says there's no malchus in that case. Reish Lakish Amar Loka. Reish Lakish says there's malchus. Why? Because the pasuk says tahora. The pasuk says a kosher animal, and so we understand tahora in a kosher animal. Yes, that's allowed. Tamei lo, but we make an inference that a non-kosher animal no. V'lav haba michlala say lokan olav. And here you have a negative commandment that's being inferred from a positive. So Reish Lakish says that's considered the same as a negative commandment, and the person does get malchus. For Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan says ein lokan olav. There's no malchus in this case because lav haba mechlala say ein lokan olav. If you have a lav that is inferred from a positive commandment, there is no malchus. And the Gemara continues most of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah asks a question from the following Brisa. The Brisa brings the pasuk, Osa tochelu, that you should eat. We'll see the full pasuk. It's talking about the kosher animals that one can eat. The pasuk says, Kol mafreses parsa v'shosa shesa parasos malas gera ba'behema osa tochelu, talking about the kosher simonim by an animal chewing its cud, split hooves. And again, the pasuk says, Osa tochelu. The pasuk says that you are able to eat. And so the Brisa continues, and the Brisa says, Osa tochelu, that you will eat, v'lo behema tameya, and not a non-kosher animal. You cannot eat a non-kosher animal. And what does the Brisa say? V'lav haba mechlal aseh aseh. If you have a lav that is inferred from an aseh, so we say that's considered to be an aseh, we say that's considered to be a positive commandment, and that seems to be exactly what Rabbi Yochanan said. Therefore, it's a question against Reish Lakish. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar le Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa. Rabbi Yaakov said to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, Asab Rolach, I will explain to you the machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. The machlokas is actually a little different than was formulated above. Be'evare behema tameya, when it comes to the limbs of a non-kosher animal, to kuli alma lo pligi, there is no machlokas. Ki pligi bechaya, the only machlokas is by a wild animal. We're going to be talking here about a kosher wild animal. That's actually the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. V'hachi itmar, and this is what was stated. This is the machlokas amoraim. Rabbi Yochanan says over biaseh, if somebody offers a kosher wild animal on the mizbeach, he transgresses a positive commandment, and Reish Lakish Amar Eino over bivelo klum. Reish Lakish says he doesn't transgress anything, not even in aseh. In this version of the machlokas, we should know that it's actually Rabbi Yochanan who is stricter. Rabbi Yochanan says over be'aseh, again, there's a transgression of a positive commandment. Reish Lakish says there is no such transgression. And the Gemara continues and explains, Rabbi Yochanan Amar over be'aseh. Rabbi Yochanan says there's a transgression of an aseh, because what does the pasuk say about the bringing of the carbon? It says behema, it says a behema, which means a domesticated animal. Behema in chayalo means a domesticated animal, yes. A chaya, a wild animal, no. Reish Lakish Amar Eino over Allah bivelo klum. Reish Lakish says there's no transgression at all, because ahula mitzvah, that's just a mitzvah. It's preferable that it be a behema, domesticated animal, but it's not a violation even of an aseh if it is a wild animal. We'll take a look at the full pasuk that they're quoting in terms of the word behema. The pasuk says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'yamarta aleim, speak to b'nei Yisrael, say to them, Adam ki yakrav mikem karban la'Hashem, when a person brings a carbon, min ha-behema, so it says in the pasuk, you bring from a behema, min ha-bakar, min ha-son takrivas karbanchem, you bring your carbon, and the idea over here also, again, as we said above, it seems to imply a kosher animal, and now we're having a discussion that also behema sounds like a domesticated animal, and that's the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And Rashi explains, behema tameya, non-kosher animals, susim ugamalim, for example, horses and camels, tahorim in kosher, yes, because again, the pasuk we just quoted, min ha-bakar o min ha-tson takrivu, it's talking about kosher animals. Osa tochelu, that you will eat, mafreses parso malaskera, again, the simonim of the kosher animals. V'lav haba mechlal aseh aseh, if you have a lav that's inferred from an aseh, it's considered to be an aseh, a positive commandment. Kach shnuya b'soch ha-braisa, umaskinon belos aseh minayin. Now the Braisa then concludes and says, where do we know lo saseh from? Talmud lomer aches zel lo tochelu, it says this you shouldn't eat. Alma mid itzrich lo saseh achareha, so you see from the fact that you need to have an actual lo saseh, so lav azharahu, so you see that the lav that was just inferred from the aseh is just an aseh, it's not considered to be a warning, it's not considered to be a negative commandment. And then the Gemara said, to kuli alma lo pligi de asehu de'ika v'sulo, there is no machlokas, everybody agrees that it's only an aseh, that's talking about by a non-kosher animal that's offered on the mizbeach. That is not the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Everybody agrees, lav haba mechlal aseh, that it's a violation of an aseh. Ki pligi b'chaya, where is there a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish? It's by a wild animal. V'lo le'inyan malchus, and the machlokas is not about malchus. Ela li'aseh, the machlokas is there an aseh? Ve'imor nami epuch to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Also, you should reverse Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Again, as mentioned, that Rabbi Yochanan's the one who's stricter here. V'hachi avishmiya le'el Rabbi Yaakov, this is what Rabbi Yaakov heard. And again, ahula mitzvah, then the Gemara said that that's just for a mitzvah that it be a behema, not a chaya. Behema mitzvah lahakriv, it's a mitzvah to bring a domesticated animal. The chaya rishus, but when it comes to a chaya, you have permission to bring a chaya. It would not be a violation to bring a chaya, but again, there's a mitzvah to bring a behema. Umiu tameya vaday lo. Now Rashi notes, nevertheless, a non-kosher animal certainly you should not bring. Dechsiv mimashke Yisrael, it says in the pasuk mimashke Yisrael means to say min hamuter li Yisrael, has to be from that which is mutter to Yisrael, kosher animal. Beperakamet the Menachos Gabi Treifa. This is in the first parak of Menachos. And the Gemara continues, Mosiv Rava. Rava asks a question from the following brisa. Ilu nemar korban laHashem behema. Had the pasuk said korban laHashem behema. Again, that's the same pasuk we looked at before. The pasuk says you're going to bring korban laHashem min ha-behema, min ha-bakar, min ha-tzon. The kind of korban you bring is min ha-behema. And so the brisa is saying, if it said korban laHashem behema, hayisi yomer chaya bechlal behema, I would have thought that a chaya, wild animal, is included in a behema. And where do we see there are wild animals included in the behema? Ke'inyan shenemar, like we find that it says in the pasuk again by the kosher animals, Zos ha-behema asher tochelu, shortzeh chesavim v'se'izim ayol utzvi. It lists here ayol and tzvi. It lists wild animals, even though it calls behema. Sometimes a behema can refer to a wild animal as well, and that's what I would have said the pasuk meant. However, Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says bakar v'tzon. It adds on the words bakar v'tzon, and we understand from that bakar v'tzon amarti lach bakar v'tzon. That's what I'm saying to you is good for a korban. Bakar and tzon implies domesticated animals, v'lo chaya, but we're not talking about chaya. We're not talking about wild animals. And the Brisa says, Yochel, one might think lo yavi, that he shouldn't bring a wild animal, vim hevi kosher. But if he does bring the wild animal, then it's kosher. Halamazeh doma, what is this similar to? L'talmud sha'amar lo rabu, it's to a student, the Rebbe says to the student, his Rebbe says to him, Have li chitim, bring me wheat. V'hevi lo chitim usa'orim, and he brings him wheat and barley. She'eno kemavir al devarv, he's not like he's transgressing his words. Elam mosav al devarv, it's just like he's adding on to his words. V'kosher, and it's kosher. And again, so therefore, one might think that that's true over here as well. If you bring the wild animal, it's kosher. It's just like adding on, and it's still okay. Talmud Lomar, again, the pasuk says bakar v'tzon. It says bakar and son. It says cattle and the flock. Bakar v'tzon amarti lach. It means to say bakar and son v'lo chaya, and not a wild animal. Halamazeh doma, what is this actually comparable to? L'talmud shamar lo rabba, to a student that his Rebbe says to him, Al tavi li elo chitin. It means to say, bring me only wheat. V'hevi lo chitin usaorim, and then he brings him wheat and barley. She'eno kemosav al devarv, that's not like adding on to his words. Elo kemavir al devarv, that's like transgressing his words. And Rashi explains, Ilu nemar korban laHashem min ha-behema. If it would have just said korban laHashem min ha-behema, v'lo piresh bakar v'tzon, and it would not have explained in the pasuk cattle and flock, hayisi omer, then I would have said, Ke'inyan shenemar zos ha-behema chsib basrei ayol utzvi, just like where it says behema by the kosher animals, and then it lists ayol and tzvi, which are wild animals. And Rashi continues, Trei bakar v'tzon ksivi hasam. It actually says bakar v'tzon twice over there. It says min ha-bakar or min ha-tzon takrivu. It says from the cattle and from the flock you're going to bring. V'hadar ksivim karbonu min habakar v'im min hatzon karbonu min haksavim. And then it says it again. It talks about bakar v'tzon, and that's actually what's going on in this brisa. First, the brisa quotes the bakar v'tzon. The first time it says bakar v'tzon, and says maybe one would think that if you bring the wild animals, it's okay. And then the brisa again says no. It says bakar v'tzon, and therefore it says it a second time. It means to say that specifically you should bring from bakar v'tzon, specifically from domesticated animals, and not from wild animals. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Daled Amid Beis.